This is Sam Long.
I'm Ron Peters.
And I'm John Nugent.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class.
Welcome back to another episode of the After Class Podcast. I'm here with John and Ron. I'm in the presence of a real man, Ron, who is now 50 plus, for those who were wondering.
Happy birthday, Ron.
Hey, thank you very much. Didn't realize that's what made one a real man. So.
I think it might actually be 40, but I mean, 50 plus, you're a real man.
Well, I appreciate that.
John and I only wish to be. So today, we are going to actually answer one of the questions we received on Facebook a little while back. We put out a plea for different topics that you all wanted to hear about and wanted us to engage. And so today we're going to answer. We're going to call that our mailbag.
The After Class mailbag.
Yes, the After Class mailbag. I've got it right here. No, not really. It's all digital, but nonetheless. On the Facebook page, we were asked about Satan and kind of like where did Satan come from? What's the deal with all that? And there's some other questions as well that we are hoping to get to, probably not in this episode because there's a lot that this one entails. So today, that is our goal, is to start with Satan in the Old Testament.
Yeah, and this dovetails real nicely with the previous podcast where we addressed some urban myths, Christian urban myths Part 2. And the one I think we spent the most time on was the serpent in the Garden of Eden, Genesis 3, and whether or not that is Satan. And our conclusion was the serpent is not Satan, that we shouldn't conflate those two. And so the mailbag question combined with the previous episode seemed to put us in a really good place to continue that conversation of who is Satan, what does the Bible say about him. And so, today I think that we can look at the Old Testament witness and I think probably debunk maybe a couple more urban myths, Christian urban myths, with regard to what the Old Testament does or does not actually say about Satan.
Yep. Shout out to Emily Parsons for the question.
Thanks, Emily.
We want to acknowledge our first grab bag practitioner.
Adoring public, I believe, is what you're looking for.
So thank you, Emily. And we're going to pick up by, before we go constructively into, what do the passages that are actually potentially talking about Satan say, we want to talk about and get out of the way two passages that are alleged passages about the devil. Yeah. That just like the Garden of Eden, when you study the text carefully, that's not clear at all. And the first one we want to deal with is from Isaiah, chapter 14, verse 12. And this is what it says. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly on the heights of Zephon. I will ascend to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. And this is a classic proof text of Satan, especially because of what happens next. In verse 15, it says, but you are brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit. And so this is an alleged passage detailing the fall of Satan, who was in the heavens, who was in the heights, but who tried to exalt himself before God and has been thrown down into the low places of Sheol. Right, and here people, I think, have images of the devil in hell with a pitchfork, maybe surrounded with flames and minions who work for him.
Yeah, the fodder of a lot of Far Side cartoons.
I actually have a cartoon I share with my class that I'll try to post when this comes out. It's Jesus, and he's got clouds behind him, and he's speaking to Satan with the horns with the fire behind him. And it says, did it hurt when you fell from heaven? Did it? And that's just it. That's it. And that's what people think about. Like that's exactly what they think. There was this angelic being that fell and now is in hell and so forth. Yeah. And it's taken because they use the language here. You're fallen from heaven. You've been laid low, etc. So continue.
Yeah. And I was reading from the NRSV. If you were to read from the old King James, where I read morning star or O day star, son of dawn, they have the King James translates that Lucifer,
Yeah.
which is the Latin word for the morning star.
Yep.
The morning star being a bright star that is so big and close that even in the morning you're able to see it. When most of the other stars are out of view, there is the morning star that you can still see.
Yeah, probably Venus, actually. Probably the planet Venus, because it is the brightest star, and you can see it even when there's daytime.
As opposed to Uranus.
Oh, you really went there, didn't
Sorry.
you?
So, moving right along. And so the question is, and especially when the King James personifies it by giving it a name, Lucifer, which sounds like a personal name.
Yeah.
In Latin, I'm not sure how that would have played. Whether they would have seen that term as, oh yeah, that's the name of a star. I mean, or whether they would have also seen that in personal terms. I don't know if you guys have any insights on that.
Yeah, I wish I had enough Latin to be able to address that. Because I think it's like a lot of things where it's probably just like you said, Lucifer just means morning star. And do you translate it or do you transliterate it? And it sounds like the King James translators transliterated it. So instead of translating it morning star, they turned it into a proper noun. And, we do that with a lot of words. The word baptism is just a Greek word that just means to immerse, and yet it got transliterated, and now it's this technical term, when in New Testament times it wasn't quite that technical. So, I can see where Lucifer may have followed the same course.
So if we were to offer a modern-day transliteration or translation, we might say Venus. If you're, in fact, right, that Venus is the star they were probably referring to, we might say Venus. How you have fallen from heaven, Venus. The star that was the most impressive that you can see even in the daytime.
Possibly. Although, at the same time, I mean, if I remember, what little Hebrew I remember, it seems like it says in Hebrew, morning star, and maybe calling it Venus might actually add some confusion. Because now, again, we're giving it a proper name, a proper noun and name.
But that might be a modern equivalent
yeah.
to the Lucifer move.
Okay. Yeah, okay, now I see what you're saying. Yeah, you're right. That might be that kind of a thing. Yeah, good point.
All right, so now let's get to the details. What is it about this passage that suggests that this might not be talking about the devil?
Well, let's start with the fact of who it's addressed to. And if you go just back to verse 4, it says, "You will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon." So already we have in the context of the actual scripture, it has an addressee, which is the king of Babylon. And so Isaiah seems to be writing to talk to this person who is enacting these things against Israel. And so we go back to our Israelite history, like, has there any king of Babylon ever done anything to Israel?
Let me think about that.
Yeah. So this verse is part of a taunt against a Babylonian king. It doesn't begin a taunt against the angelic adversary of God's people or God or the prince of darkness. It doesn't begin by addressing the devil or even a non-human figure of angelic status. And it's part of a string of oracles about the kings of various nations.
Right.
So from chapter 13 through, I believe, somewhere around 21, we have a string of oracles about nations besides Israel. And there are little excerpts that talk about Israel, but mostly oracles against other nations. So beginning later on in the chapter in verse 24, an oracle concerning Assyria. Chapter 15, an oracle concerning Moab. Chapter 17, an oracle concerning Damascus. And it goes on. But it starts out with an oracle concerning Babylon.
Yeah.
So that's the context of the passage. So when the passage is introduced as overtly identifying the person being talked about as a Babylonian king, then we have to say, well, what is there in the text to overturn that, to make us think, wait a second, he switched topics here, now he's talking about the devil, and then he's going to go back to talking about the nations. What do we have here?
Our silence
To counteract it, I would not say a whole lot. except that he switches to, he does bring in a little bit of like some Canaanite mythological stuff. So when you talk about these two words, like day star and dawn, they're Hebrew words that can be, their roots can be associated with Canaanite deities. You got Zaphon there at the end of 13, which is this mountain in which, for example, Baal may sit and reign. So there's mythological things going in there, but I think he's using them as typology to talk about the king. And so I think it's still talking about the king, but bringing in some other things to do that, as opposed to specific things like you're a terrible person who killed a bunch of people. Now he's using it as, you talk about yourself like the deities. You're setting yourself up like a god, and it's a long way down from heaven.
Yeah. I remember one time, many, many years ago, asking a pastor about this passage. And, on my reading of it, I was like, why can't this just be the king of Babylon? Why do we have to infer something more about Satan? And his response was, well, the boast is too arrogant for a mere mortal. Like a mere mortal would never say that. I know, right? Yeah, and I'm not sure why it didn't enter his mind that mortals do boast this way. And in fact, Babylonian kings, pharaohs of Egypt, often reigned as gods. They were viewed as gods in their own lifetimes and frequently viewed themselves as gods. And so why would we be surprised that a king of a vast empire would see himself in a deific kind of a way and boast as if he's on par with the gods? And then we wouldn't be surprised that Isaiah would then use that kind of language to bring him down. Say, you talk like you're one of the gods. Guess what? You're not. And the real God is going to show you. He's going to prove it to you.
Yeah, so if we're going to read our passage in context, we're going to back up to see it begins by addressing the king of Babylon. And as it talks about the king of Babylon, it says that the Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of the rulers, that struck down peoples in wrath with unceasing blows, that ruled the nations in anger with unrelenting persecution. So he's talking about a king who's ruling over nations in ways that are overbearing, and that God is going to punish him for that. And then he goes on to talk about how this self-exalted king will be brought low. He will be greeted by the shades in Sheol. And he'll be brought down to the pit, to death. He's going to die like every other man.
Yeah.
And then in our passage, beginning in verse 12, there's a metaphor here. The king who has in his own eyes exalted himself to the heavens has been brought low. And this is not the only passage in the Bible to talk this way about the nations. In Obadiah, there's a passage that talks about the king of Edom exalting himself in the heights and being brought low from his high perch. And so this is a common way to say, you think you're all great, you think you're on top of the world. We use that language, on top of the world.
Yeah.
And we don't literally mean someone has, gotten on top of the sphere of the globe.
Flat earthers may feel different, but that's fine.
Yeah. And so after it says in 13, you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars of God. After it says that, it says in 15, but you are brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you, and they will say, quote, this is verse 16, is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities, who would not let his prisoners go home?
Yeah. So specifically identified as a man, that word man, human being, is used. And certainly it comports with what happened with Babylon. I mean, everybody was in terror of Babylon. They were the world superpower, and they were kicking everybody's butts and expanding their empire, and people were afraid. And they thought, this empire is so militarily powerful, who can defeat them? And then when Babylon does fall, eventually to the Medo-Persian Empire, people are like, oh my gosh, we didn't think Babylon could fall, but they did. And it was surprising to them.
So here we have an instance that's a lot like the Genesis account. In the text itself, there are no clues that we're talking about anything else but the wisest of the animals.
Yeah.
And there's no account of how this wisest of the animals that was lowered and made to eat dust becomes a giant dragon figure who's wreaking havoc all over the earth in Revelation. That account is missing. The bridge between worm-like punished creature to great nemesis with multiple heads dominating over humans and causing terror on earth. There's no narrative in the Bible to get from A to B.
Right.
Similarly, there's nothing in the text between the introduction, this is about the king of Babylon, to the passage about you are fallen from heaven, O day star. There's nothing to suggest that we've stopped talking about that king.
Right.
And immediately after the proof text of Satan's alleged fall, we are talking about a man still.
Yeah.
So here's just a pure case where people come to the Bible with a pre-existing notion of the story of the devil's fall. And they're finding a passage that sounds like it could be used to say that.
Right.
But when we cross-examine it, looks like it's a poetic way to smack down a king who's gotten too big for his britches.
Yeah.
It's a precursor of Shelley's Ozymandias poem. Right, are you all familiar with Ozymandias? There's a statue.
No,
Wow.
Nice.
Enlighten us.
Yes, please.
I can't remember it. George will be so upset that I can't remember the actual words. But basically, it's the idea is that there's this statue, and on it's this huge statue. This man Ozymandias, he's king of kings, and like let anyone who walks by and sees it, be afraid and taken my mighty works. And then, but the actual statue has now been broken down and lays half sunken in sand, right? And that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Like, proclaiming that I'm the very best in the world and no one can stop me. I'm greater than the gods. Guess what? You're going to be a broken statue in the sand at some point.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. And it makes sense in its context as the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar or whoever it is. It makes perfect sense. You don't have to read it and go, wow, we have to interpret this some other way because otherwise it just seems really weird to us. It doesn't make sense. So the entire passage as a rebuke of the king of Babylon works. And so I think that those who would want to challenge that are the ones who are really going to have to come up with a robust argument to say, no, it means something else.
Yeah. Now, when I started teaching as a professor, I thought the garden passage, and the Isaiah passage were the only two proof texts from the Old Testament that talk about Satan's fall. Then I learned from students while teaching through the book of Ezekiel that there's another chapter that I had no idea people ever associated with
Youth
the devil.
Ministers love this one. Just a heads up.
So we're talking about Ezekiel 28. Does someone want to read this passage from verses 13 to 16?
Doing our sword drill here.
I'm already there, man.
Oh, look at you.
I dominated sword drills when I was 12.
You might want to start in the middle of verse 12.
Right.
Not at the beginning of verse
Correct.
12.
You were the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. A bunch of stones I'm not going to... and were gold in your settings and your engravings. On the day you were created that they were prepared. With an anointed cherub as guardian, I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked among the stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day that you were created until iniquity was found in you. How far do you want me to go?
Skip the first half of 16 and do the second half of 16.
Yes.
So I
cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and the guardian cherub drove you out from among the stones of fire. Your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. We'll stop there.
All right. So here we have an account of the Garden of Eden, now located on a mountain, interestingly. Topic for another day.
Right.
And there's this cherub figure, this angelic figure. There's this beautiful figure who was at one point pure and blameless and now has become wicked and has been cast down by God. Therefore, we have here the origin of Satan.
Yes, and this is where they pull from this. Oh, it was a perfect, beautiful angel that turns back on God and was kicked out, and they get that all from here. I'm not sure how, but they get that all from here. Yeah. The angel part's not really mentioned, but nonetheless. And so this creation of God, so it's not just the fall of humanity; it's the fall of this angelic being as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the NRSV doesn't quite read that way. I mean,
no.
The NRSV reads that that it was an angel that kind of drove this beautiful being out of the garden.
Right.
But that's not how the NIV reads. And I think here, just like I think the King James is responsible for Lucifer kind of easily slipping into being about Satan, that translation, the NIV translates it in a way that describes the person being described as a cherub, right? The cherub is not an angel that's guarding this person in the garden and then driving this beautiful fallen creature out. In the NIV, the cherub is the beautiful being that's being... So let me just read little pieces of this. It says, in the NIV, the same passage, you were anointed as a guardian cherub.
Yeah.
For so I have ordained you in verse 14. And then in verse 16, so I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God. I expelled you, guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones.
Yep.
So here's a case where the translators have made the cherub the object of God's judgment.
Right.
Whereas in the NRSV, the cherub, the angel, is the one who metes out God's judgment.
The instrument of his judgment.
Yeah, the instrument. Those are two different translations.
Yeah.
And if you have in mind, because of other books like Job and Zechariah and passages in the New Testament, that the devil is an angel, here we have an angel being driven out, an angel being punished. And so it's a lot easier to try to connect this to Satan.
Yeah. And you can see where the serpent is easily connected with Satan. You were in the Garden of Eden. You were Eden. And so, look at that. You were in Eden. The serpent, Satan. So, yep, this must be talking about Satan.
Yeah, so this one presupposes that the Genesis one is about the devil.
Right.
Without that presupposition, you're not going to get this.
Yeah.
But of course, all of them hang together, right?
Right.
They all reinforce one another. But again, I think we have to evaluate this. This is a possible interpretation of this passage. Is there anything in the context of this passage that introduces it? Is there anything in the text itself that suggests that this passage, like the other two, isn't really talking about the devil?
Well, the only problem is there's context.
Context
ruins
always
interpretations all the time, right?
Oh, just
so John didn't have me read the beginning of verse 12 because it gives it away right from there.
right.
Mortal, raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre, and say to him, thus says the Lord God. There's just like Isaiah was a clear addressee, the king of Babylon. Here, there's a clear addressee, the king of Tyre.
And so, do our listeners know what Tyre was? I mean, I think most people have heard of Babylon.
It's round, it's rubber.
You need 4 of them on your car, 4 good ones if you're going to get anywhere. Except this is built.
I mean, that's an
TYR.
important question, yeah. The background to that. Yeah. Tyre's a city north of Israel, Phoenician, large trade center. There was good interaction early on in Israel's history. For example, Hiram, king of Tyre, supplied the materials for building the temple. Of course, Solomon then gave away part of the promised land to him as payment, but that's a topic for another day. Right. But there was good relationships, but apparently that ended at some point. And there we have other battles with this kingdom that take place after that.
Yeah, and so it strikes me as maybe significant. You guys can affirm or correct me on this, but as opposed to Babylon, which was far away, I'm sure Israel interacted with Babylon maybe in trade or something like that, but Tyre is close by. I mean, Tyre is they're neighbors. Israel and Phoenicia are neighbors. Tyre is one of the main cities. Tyre and Sidon are always mentioned together as the 2 big cities. I can't help but notice that this is just one part of a lengthy section on Tyre. before this lamentation, there's an oracle, I guess, against Tyre specifically, almost like a whole chapter, which in itself, like back in Isaiah, was part of a series of oracles against various nations or cities. But maybe he seems to spend a lot of time going after Tyre. And I wonder if part of that is because Israel had a sort of a close personal relationship with Tyre, knew them better, and maybe for that reason, the prophet has more to say about Tyre. And this is really a really long thing.
3 chapters worth.
Yeah.
Starts in 26 and ends in 28.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this, like Isaiah, this is a part of a 10-chapter section from chapters 25 to 35, oracles against various nations. Yeah. It's just a cluster. They're not even in chronological order. They're kind of grouped by topic.
Yeah.
And so just like Isaiah, it's a section about nations. The immediate 3 chapters of context are about the king of Tyre. And this very oracle begins saying about the king of Tyre. And if you study all the other oracles against Tyre, not just in this book and in others, we learn that one of the main criticisms of Tyre is their pride because of their wealth, which is all rooted in their trade.
Yeah.
They were a major Mediterranean seaport. They were a way that precious gems entered into Palestine from faraway lands.
Yeah.
And other goods and products entered into the land of Canaan. And so when you're the middleman in trade, you become very wealthy.
Yep. Yeah.
And that's what they were, one of the most wealthy nations around and a source of all sorts of magnificent trinkets and gems and stones, and that's where they made their money, and that's what they were known for.
Yeah.
That's really important.
Yeah.
Why would a prophet talk about a king as if he was surrounded by stones and gems in the Garden of Eden? This is, again, a metaphor, a way of talking about a king in metaphorical terms that describe their unique attributes.
Yeah.
And so we know from Genesis that the area and the region around the garden, not necessarily in the garden, but at least the land of Havilah, and there was lots of gold and precious stones around the area. And so it's a small step to say, you know what, just like the Garden of Eden once was a perfect and pure and wonderful place that was just loaded with God's blessings and bounty, so Tyre is a blessed nation, strategically located on the Mediterranean Sea, the perfect go-between in a lucrative trade market. They're blessed with opportunity to make lots of money.
Yeah.
And of course, if God blesses you with opportunity to make lots of money, it's so that you can be a blessing to others.
Right.
To be in the field of trade does not necessitate that you grow wealthy at the expense of other people. But here, Tyre has a track record of hogging the wealth to themselves, and that leads to the exploitation of other people who do the hard work of mining the mines to get the stones, right? Who get paid very little. It's the brokers in the middle that are lavish with wealth.
Yeah.
So I think the key word there is pride. And so they have this pride and exalt themselves. And so this fall from heaven motif enters in, which was a common one in the ancient world, talking about the demise of kings. Mm-hmm. Like we act like the fall from heaven motif is just about angelic beings, but for them, that was part of it. And this whole section brings in all sorts of references to Ugaritic literature and Canaanite mythology, and this is just another example of that, where it's kind of mixing and matching things that they would know with, like Eden. Eden is not mentioned in other religions and texts. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just the biblical text. But he brings in these other ideas to talk about this. There was this blessing, as you're saying, there was this perfection, and like Adam and Eve, there was this expectation of what to do with it. Mm-hmm. And like they failed, you failed. And like they were kicked out, you're going to be kicked out of your wealth, of your situation, a blessing as you described it. And so that's what's going on here. Yeah. I think with the background, it's pretty straightforward and simple. You don't have to read a lot into it. But since they use all this metaphorical language and imagery, it's hard for us to we would like them to say, well, why didn't he just say that? Why didn't Ezekiel just say, King of Tyre, you and your people, because you're a bunch of prideful jerks, are going to go down?
Yeah.
I don't know, but that's what they do, and that's what they did back then.
And this is poetry.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a poetic oracle.
Yeah.
And most of the prophetic oracles are poetic in nature. I mean, it's not like he's doing something unusual here. Poetry is common in these oracles. In fact, I almost wonder if I've actually just thought this recently. Now I'm going to just kind of go off on a tangent slightly, but noting that the oracles are poetic, is there a relationship between art and prophecy? This may be a podcast for later down the road, but poetry and music and prophecy, is there some sort of relationship between those? Because so much of prophecy is at least poetic, and who knows, maybe they were sung. I don't know that. I'm not an expert in that field.
Yeah. That is a pretty big topic, and I would just say this much, that I get the impression when reading the Bible that when people gave official public speeches in the ancient world, they spoke in poetry. They spoke in not Dr. Seuss rhyme poetry. They spoke in Hebrew parallelism.
Yeah,
they're given. So when you haven't, most of the prophets they're people who have given public speeches, and almost all of the prophets' material is poetry. And even in narratives like Genesis, when we stop and hear a quote out of someone's mouth, often it's in poetry if they're addressing a large audience. And so this partly has to do, I think, in a culture that is an oral culture, that doesn't have things that are written down. You're giving speeches that are not being transcribed all the time. You get into the habit of speaking in ways that are memorable. And so the parallelism, the symbolic imagery, they go the extra mile to be remembered. And so I think it's a part of that culture to, when they're speaking in public, to speak in poetic ways that are memorable.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I totally agree with that, that if you want to do something in a way that it employs mnemonic devices, memory aids, poetry does that. I think in addition to that, I think it's meant to be evocative, that the imagery is meant to not only touch the intellect, but touch the emotions. So imagery, poetic imagery, metaphor, things of that nature are very evocative. They give you that kind of emotional response that I think resonates with people, and so makes the prophecy more vivid to the audience, so that when they're listening to it, they, on the one hand, really kind of connect with the idea that, man, these guys really have gone too far in their pride. And then when you use that kind of evocative imagery to describe their downfall, they go, yeah, that's going to be really bad. And so, yeah, it touches the emotions as well as the intellect by using that kind of imagery.
Yeah. And so I want to point out something in the text. We've already talked about the wider chapters are oracles against nations. This very chapter began with an introduction that this was about the king of Tyre. And we've kind of skipped over some content in our reading that makes explicit connections to the king of Tyre within this very section. And so verse 14, with an anointed cherub as guardian I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked among the stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until iniquity was found in you. And then verse 16, in the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence and you sinned. In the abundance of your trade.
Satan was kicked out for doing too many deals in heaven. That's what I get from that.
Right. That is right in the middle of this passage, right after identifying him as a cherub, or at least using cherub language in that context. Right before your heart was proud because of your beauty, it talks about the main problem with this being is their abundance of trade and violence and how they exploited people for wealth. This was the main problem, and entirely lacking in the Bible from Genesis to Revelation is the devil as a middleman in trade.
Right. Yeah.
That's not a biblical motif.
Yeah, exactly. Although I did once hear somebody try to make that. It was so long ago, I can't even remember the details. But I remember somebody trying to tie that in to Satan's function in heaven. And I wish I could remember more details on it, but somebody tried to force that.
Yeah. This would obviously be the basis. If you assume this is about the devil, now you've got good dirt on the devil. Ooh, I know what he does up there. Yeah. He's a trade broker. Or it could be that this is really about the king of Tyre. a king whose stock and trade was trade.
Yeah. And that's where, again, context really helps it to make sense, because we have a literary context which just says king of Tyre. An Israelite hearing this prophecy would know who that was. They'd know where Tyre is situated. They would know what Tyre was all about. And that gets us into the next part of context, which is historical context, cultural context, economic context. All of this stuff would have made perfect sense to an Israelite hearing this prophecy. And I can't imagine that any Israelite would go, that just doesn't sound like Tyre to me. This must be talking about something else. No, they would go, this makes perfect sense, because everything we know about Tyre and its king comports with what we're hearing in this prophecy.
And I maybe should say something about the translation issue between the NIV and the NRSV.
Oh, right, yeah.
I mean, in the Hebrew, it is true that the translation is kind of ambiguous. Whether the cherub is the object doing the driving out or the object being driven out, you can make a case for either direction.
Okay.
So I don't think the NIV is on a holiday for translating it in its direction. I think it's a possible translation. And even if that were the case, if the being talked about was a cherub, then we would still have a metaphor of the king of Tyre being described as a cherub, surrounded by beautiful things, that is punished by God, like an angel who gets punished by God. And that itself would it'd still be a metaphor talking about the king of Tyre.
Yeah.
But given the fact that our account in Genesis of the Garden of Eden has an angel that blocks the way into the garden, that is the guardian to keep people out, right, it seems likely that the cherub being talked about is the guardian angel, not the person being kicked out.
Yeah.
Agree.
So, anything more to deal with in this passage, or are we done with?
I think we've covered that pretty clearly. But I mean, I've had these same conversations with people, and they still don't at the end say no. It's about Satan.
Yeah.
And I don't know what else to say. So I hope you're not one of those people. I hope you hear this and it makes sense. Like, oh, I guess I misunderstood it. And they were taught by probably people who, they respected, taught them that this is about Satan. And I think those people are probably well-intentioned. We talk about that all the time. That's the whole point of the urban myths, is people are well-intentioned in saying these things. They're just not accurate.
Yeah, and certainly that's what I was taught. And for a long time, that's exactly how I interpreted these passages. The Isaiah passage, the Ezekiel passage. Always thought that the serpent and Satan were the same guy. And over time, I had just a willingness to examine my assumptions. To really just say, where does the evidence lead? What evidence do we have to support this, or is there evidence? Is there a compelling argument to say, maybe I need to rethink this? And when I ask what's at stake, a lot of times when I'm confronted with something that challenges what I've always been taught or what I believe, I ask what's at stake. If I suddenly have to change my thinking, if I have to interpret a passage differently, am I going to lose anything? Is something really significant be lost? Especially for these, it's like, what am I losing? Okay, the Old Testament doesn't say that much about Satan. Ouch. So I don't think that, for me at least, it was an easy move for me to make, because there just wasn't much at stake for me on holding on to the previous views I had.
Yeah, and this translation or this interpretation we're giving, this is kind of mainstream for Old Testament scholars.
Right.
Yeah.
We're not suggesting something that's far afield.
Right. Yeah.
It may not be mainstream knowledge for preachers and Sunday school teachers, but among Bible scholars, there's widespread agreement about this. So now that we've kind of cleared the deck of the passages that aren't really about the devil, it is time to talk about the passages that may actually be talking about the devil in the Old Testament. And by it is time, I don't mean in this podcast episode. Right. I mean, our next episode is going to talk about what are the passages that might actually be talking about the devil.
Yeah.
And we're going to try to build our constructive case for what the Old Testament says, and then transition from there in maybe an additional podcast episode of how the New Testament picks up with that and runs with it.
Right.
So thank you for joining us in this week's episode of After Class, because
the best conversations happen
after class.
This is Mike Harrison, Academic Dean at Great Lakes Christian College. This podcast cannot be taken for credit, audited, nor listened to for any type of grade. Listeners do so at their own risk.